Today I'm going to talk first, and then I'm Helen Fallon, by the way, and I'm the Deputy Librarian here at Maynooth University. I'm editor of a forthcoming book, Man of Peace, and it's writings inspired, poems and essays inspired by the Kinsarawiwa collection at Maynooth University. So I'll speak first, and then the publisher, Firoze Manji from Geographically Press, will speak after me. So without further ado, I'll go on to my next slide. Just for any of you who aren't aware of Kinsarawiwa, and I know that's very few, he was a leading Nigerian writer, a businessman, and an activist. And he was concerned about the environmental destruction of his homeland, Ogoni, which is in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. And the activities of Royal Dutch Shell particularly had absolutely devastated the landscape, polluted the waters, and really ruined people's lives and livelihoods. And you can see here one of the photographs from Ogoni, which is part of the archive, and that gives you some idea of living conditions in Ogoni. Now, for his efforts, Kinsarawiwa and 8 of his other colleagues, they became known as the Ogoni 9, were sentenced to death, and they were executed on the 10th of November 1995. While Sarawiwa was on death row, he had a correspondence with Sister Magella McCarran, an Irish nun from Our Lady of Apostles congregation. Now, Sister Magella had been in Nigeria for over 30 years, and she was working with Sarawiwa to highlight the plight of the Ogoni people and what was happening to them. And she was very active in campaigning to try to save his life and the lives of his 8 colleagues, and sadly that was unsuccessful. Sister Magella donated the correspondence to Maynooth University Library, and we were really thrilled to get this, obviously, and it was such a major human rights collection to acquire. So we set about publishing the letters and working with the Sarawiwa family to make Sarawiwa's writings an inspiration really going forward for human rights activists, for scholars, etc. So the book Silence Would Be Treason is those letters and poems written by Sarawiwa and contextual essays by 3 of us from Maynooth who edited the collection. And we had gone to Firoze Manji from Geographically Press because we knew they were leading publishers in the whole human rights field, and also that the Firoze really supported the concept of open access. So Silence Would Be Treason was published in 2013 and launched by Dr. Owens Wiwa, brother of Kinsarawiwa, here at Maynooth University, and a second edition was published in 2018, a revised edition. So Firoze was the man I went back to when considering an anniversary edition. And this is what will now be coming out in early December. It'll be formally launched on the 10th of December. And it's a collection of essays and poems inspired by the Maynooth University Kinsarawiwa collection, which I edited. So to tell you a little bit about it, there's 21 essays from different parts of the globe, and I'll come on to that in a subsequent slide. There's 35 poems from the Kinsarawiwa poetry competition, and we'll be having a poetry evening on the 10th of November, and the book launch on the 10th of December. And the book will be for sale at €10, but also it'll be freely available on open access, which is very much in keeping with Maynooth University's commitment to open access. Okay, so here's a little bit from the table of contents. The foreword to the book, which isn't on this slide, was written by Dr. Jimmy Irvine, who's our Vice President for Equality and Diversity. That's followed by an introduction by myself, and then we come on to the essays proper. So the first is by Dr. Owens Wiwa, Ken's brother, and it's a really very moving and evocative account of, first of all, growing up with an older brother who came home and told him, you know, you can't just cure people. Owen's is a medical doctor. When they're victims of this type of pollution, we have to look at the sources, etc. So Owen tells all that. He also talks about all the events in Ogoni and indeed his subsequent going into hiding and going to Canada for a period. He's now back in Nigeria. Following that, there's an interview with No Sarawiwa, who I understand may have actually joined us at this point. Welcome, No, if you are here. And that's a really moving story too, about her childhood in London and returning home to Nigeria during the summer holidays, and the learning of her father's execution when she was at university in London. And of course, Sister Magella McCarran is very well represented in the collection with 2 essays. And we're delighted to have those. The next person, Daniel Leader, he is from Leaday legal firm in the UK, and they represented Ogoni communities who took cases against Shell for legal redress for the devastation of their homeland. We have Dr. Samuel Odogbo next, and he's a PhD student here at Maynooth, and some of you may have heard Samuel speak at other events. Nemo Bassi, who's a major human rights activist, a Nigerian, and a contemporary of Sarawiwa. I'm sorry, I won't try to pronounce your name, Yomi, and I know you're here, so welcome, telling us a bit about the anthropology of the Niger Delta. Mark Dummett from Amnesty International, he heads their human rights section, and it's wonderful again. He's been a keynote speaker in Maynooth. Dr. Lawrence Cox, who's here from Maynooth University from the sociology department. Firoze Manji, the publisher. Siobhan Curran is from Trócaire, and really it's tremendous to see the work that Trócaire is doing in relation to human rights defenders internationally. And we have worked with Trócaire in the library. We've had exhibitions, and indeed Trócaire helped fund the publication of Silence Would Be Treason. So we're extremely grateful to them. And then we have Tony Daly and Ciara Regan, who are from the group 8020 and to do many other things besides. And they organised a wonderful exhibition earlier in the year, and it was Objects and Solidarity. And an object can tell so much. We gave surrogates of letters and also some other items into the exhibition. And it was so wonderful. I was there myself and seeing all the things from the Dunnes Stores strike, poems by people, artifacts, etc. Really tremendous. The next is the issue, very close to what myself and Firoze are talking about today, an essay by myself and him on open access. Then I'm pleased to say we have a number of contributors from the university library, and Ciara Joyce and Roisin Berry talk about an initiative or write about an initiative to integrate the archive into the postgraduate curriculum, while Hugh Murphy, who's our head of collections and content, shares with us his thoughts on diversity in university library collections, and that's a fascinating topic. Dr. Cian Murphy from our law department, who specialises in migration and human rights and who is responsible for overseeing the University of Sanctuary, which Maynooth has recently become, also has a chapter, as has Camilla Fitzsimons, Philomena Obasi, and Veronica Akinburiwa. And we worked with that trio to devise a diversity training program for Maynooth Library staff, and myself and Laura Connaughton and Edel Cosgrove share our experiences of that. So that's the essays. Then we've also got the poems. We've been having a Ken Sarawiwa poetry competition for 3 years in order to highlight issues such as pollution, human rights, environmental rights with school children. We broadened it this year to an open poetry competition. So there was an adult category as well as the school category. And we had tremendous level of responses. And Irish poet and creative writing teacher, Jessica Traynor judged the competition. And indeed, Sister Magella McCarran surprised us with 5 poems, which she had actually written. And I'm quite reflective on the time of Ken Saro-Wiwa's execution and hearing about his death and the wake that was held for him. And so many of you are Irish and you know how important a wake is, but of course there was no possibility of having a wake, but people in Dublin honoured him the night of the execution. And indeed Leeson Street, I think, or some street off Leeson Street, was renamed Ken Saro-Wiwa Street for a period, and Tony Daly talks about that in his essay. And the final closing essay is by our own David Reinhardt, who talks about the poems and how through poetry we can look at issues that are often very difficult and maybe come to more common understandings. And now, when the book becomes available, I want to say it will be available to the Maynooth University Research Archive Library, shortened to Mural, and that archive library has over 12,000 items in it. It includes articles, theses, some books, etc. And I think the items have been downloaded, different items, around 5 million times. So we're delighted we're able to share with people worldwide tremendous range of resources. And for example, we don't have this book because we're at the final stages of editing up yet, but you can see that's the link to Silence Would Be Treason, the last book, and you just click on that to download it. So anyone, anywhere in the world can have this book free of charge. And I just put in these 2 lovely images from the first and the second edition of the book. So you can see they're already in Mural. And as I mentioned, I mentioned that we're having a few events, and on the 10th of November, we'll be having a poetry evening. So just if you want more information on that, follow me on Twitter, that's the easiest thing, or email me. On the 10th of December, we'll be having a book launch, and we'll be of the book Man of Peace. And we'll be having a podcast launch as well, because the school poets, school entrance, we've made a podcast, or we're in the process of doing that. Now, the first prize in the school category was won by Conor Walsh from Maynooth Community College. I thought it would be nice. I asked my colleague who's online, David Reinhardt, to read this poem aloud. So we'll take a moment, and this, as I say, was the first prize in the school category. So David, can I hand over to you for a moment?
Okay. Bystander. As he reached into his pocket, he felt the cold metal key. It sends a shiver up his spine, but that will dissipate in an instant. He turns around to take one last look at the site before it becomes a profit-driven retail outlet. He sees the family, a father, mother, and 4 children, attempting to hold back the emotions. As they pack frantically, he ponders how they must feel, the emotions that are consuming them. They certainly won't simply dissipate. A tear comes to his eye. But he reminds himself, this is not his fault. He's only doing his job. He's an innocent bystander. What more could he have done?
Thank you very much, David, for that. So this last slide, before I hand over to Firoze, this is just an extract Saro-Wiwa's writing. Oops, let's go back up. Where he says how much he enjoys receiving our letters and keep putting our thoughts on paper. Who knows how we can use them in future? The Ogoni story will have to be told. So I think all the contributors, the essayists and the poets in this book are certainly contributing to continuing to tell the Ogoni story and the ideals embodied by Ken Saro-Wiwa in his writing and his activities. So at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Firoze Manji, who will speak to you, and then after that we will take questions. And comments. We're quite a large group, so if possible, could you put your comments into the chat box and questions? Thanks very much. So Firoze, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to to be here. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this discussion. I want to talk about the importance of the struggle to return knowledge to the commons. We are living in an era of neoliberalism, an era of privatization. In this era, individualism, private acquisition, expropriation, profiteering, extortion, and concern only for the fast buck without care for the future of humanity, or indeed the future of the planet. In these circumstances, we cannot be neutral. There is no fence to sit on. It was privatized long ago. I think we're told that there are no resources for education, for health, social support, but yet there is plenty for arms, warfare, murder, torture, and destruction. In my view, neoliberalism is a return, albeit in new forms and new conditions, to the fundamental tenets of liberalism, in which a sacred zone was constructed for the privileged minority, while the rest of humanity was condemned to the sacrifice zones. This is the context in which we need to understand the nature of open access. The privatization of knowledge is part of the restriction of information, knowledge, understanding only to the sacred zone. And open access is clearly a contested zone. Knowledge and education are intertwined. The process, education is really a process of gaining an authority over one's own experience. But it is not merely contained in books, journals, and academic writings. I think too often so insufficiently recognized is the organizing that goes on for justice, freedom, and dignity, which are critical components of knowledge. Knowledge is generated in conditions where these kind of struggles take place, but it's not always recognized. The kind of knowledge that happens out of organizing communities, about protesting against things like Shell's destruction of the Ogoniland. These are things that are generally seen to belong to the sacrifice zones, not to the sacred zone, which is why the University of Maynooth's work on Ken Saro-Wiwa and the struggle, indeed also the struggles in Ireland, are really important in asserting that these are legitimate grounds for the generation of knowledge, even if it isn't perhaps given sufficient recognition. The acquisition of knowledge clearly is important, and it's a basis, I guess, for what to think. But there are problems even within that. Some claim that academic and scientific discourses tend to be from a sort of paternalistic, uninformed, and completely, quote, educator versus the native approach. And I think we have a problem here also because the inheritance of the colonial relationship in academia is often perpetrated today in ways that parallel how the extractive industries, mining, agriculture, and so on, operate in the global south. They source raw materials, primary products, which are then processed in the global north. So in academia, we see how data and information are collected from the global south as raw materials for articles, books, theses, and are then processed and published in the north. A glance at most journals will show how few articles refer to the intellectual work that is actually undertaken in the global south. But, you know, there is this impression that, you know, the questioning, you know, do Africans really think? And the issue I think we have to focus on is that knowledge is not merely about what to think, but also how to think. And there is a tendency for people to forget that in fact, what we may think we think before we act, but in reality, it is only through the engagement of struggles for justice that actually one learns how to think. And I think that's, again, a really important point and very important acknowledgement, again, that Maynooth has done on the work of Sarawiwa, which is so important. Yes, okay, so let me show a few slides about, because so much of knowledge today is transmitted or stored over the internet. The Economic Commission for Africa in 1999 reported that Africa generates only 0.4%, 0.4% of global content that appears on the internet. And if we exclude South Africa from that, it amounts to a mere 0.2%. The whole continent of Africa contains only about 2.6 of the world's geotagged Wikipedia articles, despite having 14% of the world's population and 20% of the world's land. And in this slide, you can see that there are more Wikipedia articles inside this little circle of Europe than outside of it. And it's a really striking imagery. If we can go at the next slide. Here we see geotagged articles in English on Wikipedia. And you can see this, it's North America and Europe and a few other places, which that bright yellow. But Africa, just a few dots here and there. This uneven distribution of knowledge carries with it the danger of spatial solipsism for the people who live inside one of Wikipedia's bubbles. It also strongly underrepresents regions such as Middle East and North Africa, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And in the global context of today's digital knowledge economies, these digital absences are likely to have material effects and consequences. This is especially true because since it's cheaper to send data, a data package from the north to the south than vice versa, and since access is greater in the north, Africa 30%, 13%, or 3% if we exclude the big countries, there is a structural built-in dominance of information coming from the north. So next slide, please. One looks at this is about the Google and the silence is about Africa. And this is the amount of index content in Google Maps per 1,000 people. And you can see that, again, it's North America and Europe that are the ones with the greatest concentration, virtually nothing in Africa. Next slide. Africa has more than 800 languages spoken amongst its various ethnic groups. However, the internet is an English-based medium, which affects the usability and content creation thereon. A vast majority of programs, applications, and services continue to be provided in English, thereby denying access to large swathes of the population and exacerbating the digital divide. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of sort of Google search by language, and where it's happening. And there's Africa, yeah? The dark continent, so to speak, with very little being accessible to people who are searching. Just to move on to the slide 6, where academic knowledge and publishers. If one looks at the slide, you can see that it's largely dominated by a handful of transnational corporations. These big ones here, and the same phenomenon occurs both in the scientific literature as well as in social sciences. Next slide, please. And here you could see the location of academic knowledge. I mean, this is Africa here, and this is North America. This is southern part of America. I mean, in Africa, it's mainly dominated by South Africa. Netherlands is very large, Germany, Europe, and so on. And we see relatively small amounts here, with Japan much larger than even China. Publishing is dominated by that small number of large companies. And in line with what has become a generalized phenomenon in the era of neoliberal capitalism, companies involved in publishing, especially of academic material, have experienced a significant concentration. For example, the top 5 most prolific publishers account for more than 50% of all papers published in 2013, and 70% of papers in the social sciences. That the major publishing houses based in the global north are deriving substantial profits from this. For example, the UK-based media group Pearson reported a revenue in excess of $700 million in 2015. And most of the libraries in the global south are simply unable to pay the uninflated prices of books and subscriptions to journals and magazines. Next slide, please. And this is just explain of user-generated content on that you'll find on Google. And again, here's Africa, comparison to North America and Europe. And again, you see China relatively small compared to Japan, in spite of the differences in population size. So what we see is that you have knowledge being generated, being produced for private self-promotion. And the whole system of academia is locked into having enough publications to be able to ensure personal promotion, personal aggrandizement. There's knowledge that's produced essentially for profit. That is, it's generating motivation. But there is also knowledge for changing the world, be it whether policy work that reveals inequities, or organizing against power. And we shouldn't underestimate the importance of art and the humanities. And again, back to Maynooth's work on again Sarawiwa and promoting his writings and his poetry, I think are really important, and important for the award of these annual competitions for poems. So to conclude, I argue that production of knowledge is actually a collective endeavor. It's never an individual endeavor. And as such, it belongs to humanity and not to a privileged minority in the sacred space. It has to contribute to the building of a universalist humanity, I would argue. And by popularizing the voice of those in the sacrifice zones is absolutely central to that process. And so let me end with a quote from Ato Sechi-Otu, an African philosopher from Ghana, who writes, "No one needs the language of universalism more viscerally, and no one speaks that language more eloquently than those who, precisely because of their intimate knowledge of abject exclusion and dehumanization, voice their incendiary fury and self-affirmation in the name of the human." Thank you.